Alright, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 11 of the Hockey Stories series. You learned that 16 teams booked their ticket to the Stanley Cup playoffs, and just because half the teams make the playoffs doesn't mean earning a spot is a simple goal. When a club goes on a surprise run, or when a team is plagued from inconsistent goaltending, the strongest teams can suffer serious setbacks that can ruin their playoff aspirations. Although they wind up missing the playoffs, one team has to at least overcome the adversity that was given to them in the first place. That's not the case for today's episode because there's only a few teams that went on to win the Stanley Cup 1 year after failing to even make the playoffs. So therefore, join me as we discuss teams that went from playoff miss to Stanley Cup champions. Let's begin with the oldest example, starting off with the 1990-1991 Pittsburgh Penguins. It's safe to say that for the most part, the Penguins were absolutely abysmal throughout the 1980s. After all, Pittsburgh only made the playoffs just 4 times in the decade, and that just doesn't cut it. Despite being led by their first overall pick in the 1984 NHL entry draft and Hall of Famer Mario Lemieux, who was establishing several records with the franchise, he had his 1990 season cut short due to chronic back pain, almost as bad as Mike Bossy, and that proved to be the final blow to their chance of making the playoffs that year. Pittsburgh wound up missing the 8th and final playoff spot in the Prince of Wales Conference that belonged to the New York Islanders by just a single point. Oh man, so close yet so far. Following this hard ending to the season, Penguins GM Craig Patrick got to work in the offseason and made some serious adjustments to their roster. They include re-signing defenseman Paul Coffey to a long-term deal as well as signing aging superstar Brian Trottier. And on top of that, the Pens drafted Czechoslovakian forward Jaromír Jágr 5th overall in the 1990 NHL entry draft. And despite that, the Penguins were forced to start the year without their superstar Mario Lemieux as he set out the first half of the season due to complications with his back. In his absence, Mark Recchi would take his place as he scored an unbelievable 40 goals to go with 113 points in 78 games played. On December 11, 1990, the Penguins would pick up Larry Murphy from the Minnesota North Stars to help bolster their blue line. In March of that year, in the hopes of becoming serious contenders for the Stanley Cup, the Penguins traded John Cullen and Jeffrey Parker to the Hartford Whalers in exchange for Ulf Samuelsson, Grant Jennings, and rising star Ron Francis. These transactions made an immediate impact on the Penguins as they finished the season on a high note, winning their first ever division title, having finished with a final record of 41-33-6. Not only did they go from 5th in their division the previous year to finishing first place in a single season of play, but thanks to some dominant playing levels from Lemieux, Recchi, Murphy, Francis, as well as Kevin Stevens, the Pittsburgh Penguins were able to take home the 1991 Stanley Cup. It was their first ever championship that they captured, and Mario Lemieux was named playoff MVP. And if you ask me, I think that's one of the best single-season rebounds in the history of the National Hockey League. Also, if you weren't that impressed enough, they went on to win the Stanley Cup again in 1992. Next up, let's have a look at the 1993-1994 New York Rangers. Even though they missed the playoffs just once from 1979 to 1992, this playoff caliber it just ain't meant to be the following year. Although they had great success from Mark Messier, Mike Gardner, and Tony Amonte, as well as being backstopped by the Beezer himself named John Van Beesbrook, the Rangers finished 10th place that year. Having missed the playoffs that year, GM Neil Smith found his new partner as he hired Mike Keenan as their head coach on April 18, 1993. Keenan has had some success with his prior teams, having made the finals twice as head coach, the first in 1987, in which the Philadelphia Flyers lost to Edmonton, and another 5 years later. Now, to say that the New York Rangers were the number one team in the regular season proved to be an understatement, as they roared through the regular season, posting an unbelievable 52-24-8 record. This was largely thanks to Messier leading the team with 84 points, and Adam Graves scoring an impressive 52 goals that year. And on top of that, Sergei Zubov and Brian Leetch would be a perfect 1-2 punch on the blue line, as well as rising star goalie Mike Richter posting an outstanding record of 42, 12, and 6 in 68 games in goal. Just hours before the trade deadline, the Rangers ended up making a series of transactions, sending Tony Amonte to the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Stéphane Matteau, as well as trading Mike Gardner to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for Glenn Anderson. To conclude it all, New York shipped off Todd Marchand to the Edmonton Oilers in exchange for Craig McTavish. These moves made an immediate impact as the Rangers won their second President's Cup in 3 years. That's how you rebound from your tough luck from last season. The first 2 rounds of the 1994 Stanley Cup playoffs were nothing too difficult, as the Rangers eliminated the New York Islanders and the Washington Capitals, going 8-1 in that span. And then New York overcame some tough matchups, as from the conference finals onwards, it would take a 7th game to decide the victor. However, thanks to some dominant playing levels from Messier, Zubov, Leetch, Graves, and Alexei Kovalev, as well as outstanding performances from Mike Richter, the Rangers were able to capture the 1994 Stanley Cup. It was the first time that they have done so in 54 years since 1940, and while I wish they would have been reminiscent to the Edmonton Oilers in the mid-1980s, winning your first championship in half a century and ending your curse that has plagued the franchise for several decades is the best way to cap off your successful year. We will continue this episode with the 2005-2006 Carolina Hurricanes. Now, the Canes, for the most part, have been around the middle of the pack from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Yes, they made it to the playoffs in consecutive years, even qualifying for the Stanley Cup Finals in 2002. However, Carolina was not able to retain this success, as they failed to even make the playoffs the next 2 years, and part of the reason that being was scoring goal issues. You know you're not going to enjoy a successful year when your star players have an inability to score goals. And you may assume that the Hurricanes have to wait one more extra year to be better, as the 2004-2005 NHL season was completely lost due to the lockouts. That said, when the league resumed play for the 2005-2006 season, Carolina embarked on one of the greatest turnarounds ever. To start things off, having spent the lockout further evaluating their roster, the Hurricanes made numerous changes in the summer of 2005. Not only did they send Arturas Urbe packing and acquiring Martin Gerber from Anaheim, Carolina also signed fellow Stanley Cup champion Corey Stillman to a 3-year contract on August 2nd of that year. That said, they also signed forward Ray Whitney for 2 years, as well as drafting Andrew Ladd 4th overall in the 2004 NHL entry draft. To top it off, they added some impressive pieces to their core that already includes Rob Brind'Amour and Eric Cole, notable blue liners such as Brett Hedican and Frantisek Kaberle, as well as their rising stars Eric Stahl and Justin Williams. Once the lockout ended and the 05-06 season began, the Hurricanes proved to be an offensive juggernaut, as Eric Stahl led the way offensively, scoring 45 goals to go with 100 points. Also, Williams and Stillman each racked in 76 points, and that resulted in Carolina winning 7 of their first 10 games, as well as 14 of their first 20 games of the year. If you thought this was great enough, Carolina took things to a much higher level, as they only lost one single game in the month of January, and from there, they won 28 of their last 44 games. By the end of the year, Carolina finished first place in the Southeast Division and second in the Eastern Conference with an impressive 52, 22, and 8 record. Having returned to the playoffs for the first time in 4 years since 2002, Carolina picked right where they left off in the regular season, and then they carried the momentum into the playoffs. Thanks to Eric Stahl and Corey Stillman scoring over a point per game pace in the playoffs, as well as outstanding play from Justin Williams and Rob Brindamore providing consistent secondary scoring, as well as outstanding goaltending from rookie netminder Cam Ward, who stole the goaltending job from Martin Gerber, the Hurricanes would defeat the underdog Edmonton Oilers in 7 games in the finals to take home the 2006 Stanley Cup. Given how it took them until the late 2010s to replicate that success, winning their first ever Stanley Cup sounds like a happy ending, if you were to ask me. We conclude this episode with the most recent example, the 2022-2023 Vegas Golden Knights. Ever since day one, the Vegas Golden Knights have been a highly competitive franchise. Not only did they make the playoffs in their first 4 years, but this also included 2 conference finals trips and 1 Stanley Cup Finals appearance in their first year in 2017-2018. Like every franchise, there's always pieces into the puzzle that helps teams get good in the end. And they include, but are certainly not limited to, William Karlsson, Riley Smith, Jonathan Marchessault, Mark Stone, and Jack Eichel. Entering the 2021-2022 season, the Knights were hoping for a spark and do the one thing that one team before them had: make it 5 straight appearances in the Stanley Cup playoffs in their first 5 years. Despite Marchessault scoring 30 goals and Chandler Stevenson's 60-plus points, the Vegas Golden Knights wound up narrowly missing out on the 8th and final playoff spot, which was owned by the Nashville Predators. Again, so close, yet so far. Unlike past organizations that we talked about in this episode, the Vegas Golden Knights have had a relatively quiet offseason as they rarely sign any free agents. In fact, the only notable players that they signed were goaltender Adin Hill and aging superstar forward Phil Kessel. In preparation for the Stanley Cup playoffs, the Knights had acquired Ivan Barbashev in a deal with the St. Louis Blues. This deal worked incredibly, as not only were they the best team in their division, but also in their conference. With Stevenson, Stone, Eichel, and Marchessault showing up, notching 20-plus points, and with Hill becoming a cornerstone in goal, posting a .932 save percentage, the Vegas Golden Knights captured the 2023 Stanley Cup. And they did that thanks to their veteran leadership on the ice, and that is how you lead by example. This concludes the story about teams that went from playoff miss to Stanley Cup champions. What do you guys think about these great turnarounds? Was each team's playoff miss simply a fluke, or was their cup win for good luck? You can let me know in the comments down below. I would like to hear your honest feedback, but otherwise, I will see you in the next episode.